Hello, welcome back, and we're going to do our next session, which is looking at designing to net zero standards for operational and embodied carbon. So a great deal of material to deal with here, and I'm delighted to welcome four guests. We've got Alex Tate, Head of Technical Practice at the RIBA, Simon Sturgis, consultant of Targeting Zero, Andrew Shepherd of Top Hat, MD of Top Hat, and Priya Gupta. And Priya, I'm really sorry, but I don't have any notes to describe where you're coming from. I'm not sure what's going on there. I'm sure I printed off the right ones, but I think I'm going to have to apologise for that. But rather than going through the detailed biogs, I'm going to sort of suggest that everybody stands up and gives, well, they don't have to stand up, they can sit, gives a very quick, brief, three point introduction to their point of view around designing to net zero standards. And then we're going to come back for a bit more of a Q&A. So firstly, Alex, would you like to take the stage first?
Sure thing. Thank you, Simon. Yeah, I'll do a very brief introduction to what the RIBA is looking at the moment and have been for the past few years. So since we joined the declaration of a climate emergency in 2019, we've been concentrating on three general areas of competence, of data collection, and of standard setting. So we've tried to make sure that we don't do anything in isolation. So all of our work is informed by construction industry collaboration, so we don't set ourselves apart from anybody else. So end of 2019, we launched the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge, which we share targets for with LETI. And we've got a new project with them and a wider collection of professional bodies to update those and develop a net zero carbon standard for buildings, which we hope to achieve by the end of the year. That'll be then be able to be used for verification purposes. We shortly after launching that climate challenge, we developed a industry-wide competence group that has resulted in something called the Climate Framework, which hopefully you can all Google and find, which has set out what we believe as an industry collective all professionals should have an awareness of, or in some cases a deep understanding of, in terms of climate literacy. And the RBA has adopted that in full and intends to make it a mandatory competence requirement for our members in the next couple of years. And then finally, we have a project that we're working on with RICS and a variety of other bodies on major data collection for whole life carbon. So there is an existing buildings carbon database that was part of the RAP research project that RICS inherited a few years ago, but it's become a bit dormant. So our intention is to refresh that and use that as the single source of major data collection for the wider construction industry on whole life carbon. That's it from me.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to ask Simon to come up if you'd like to provide a few words in introduction.
Thank you, Simon. Yes. It actually follows on rather neatly from what Alex has said. I've got 3 points as well. The first one is about net zero and definitions. And of course, I think it's fair to say that if you look in different places, you'll find different versions of what net zero really is. And what we're trying to do, will feed into the RICS professional statement update, which will hopefully happen in the next few months, or come to a conclusion in the next 4 to 6 months. And the idea here is to the group, and the group covers people from LETI, RIBA, SIBC, iStruct, UKGBC, and so on. And the idea is to have a sort of collection of definitions from embodied carbon, operational carbon, whole life carbon, and so on. And that all of those form a sort of basis. Now, we did an initial version which was published in May last year by LETI and you can get the early version on the LETI website, but it's gone through a few changes. So that's pretty important, I think, is to define what these terms mean. The second thing I wanted to talk about was cost and carbon reduction, and and also how the supply chain fits into that, and how we can encourage innovation in this area. And I think the first point I wanted to make on this was that certainly in my experience, I think this is sort of generally the case, is that it is absolutely possible today, with current supply chains and technology, to achieve 20 to 30% reductions against a sort of notional 1990, 2000 level of construction, to get 20 to 30% reductions, carbon reductions, with no extra cost. And the question then is, of course, is how do we move on to the next step down, because we need to get to net zero by 2050. And indeed, we need to get 78% reductions by 2035. So there's quite a lot to do. And it's how we step down. So as I say, there's already a part of that I think can be achieved without cost. It's a question of incentivizing the supply chain, and encouraging people to innovate. And of course, that's a supply and demand thing. If people are asking for low carbon buildings, then of course the supply chain will ultimately respond. And the final point is sort of hoping to spur that on, which is to do with the Environmental Audit Committee at the House of Commons, which I was a special advisor to, and that produced a report towards the end of May on whole life carbon. And the idea behind all of that is what the report covers is things like planning, possible new planning regulations or building regulations, and really how whole life carbon should fit into all of that, but also addressing things like materials, and things like Part Z and so on. So hopefully, if this is adopted, and there's, of course, once one of these special committee reports is produced, the relevant government departments have to respond, and I know that that's what they're doing, and they have to respond within 2 months. So hopefully by May, June, or late July, end of July, we should have some responses from government departments on whole life carbon in this area. So those are my 3 points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. And over to Andrew Shepherd of Top Hat. Your perspectives from the housing industry.
Thanks, Simon. And it was good to sort of take the handover from Simon. He was talking about what the supply chain can do. We are essentially the supply chain as a manufacturer of volumetric homes that we deliver into the UK housing market. We are absolutely focused on embodied carbon as an organisation. We really look at this and we spend the time to analyse what we do, how we do it, and how we can improve. So currently we're achieving A++ against the RIBA standards. So we are delivering sort of under 200 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared. And it probably makes us one of the lowest carbon providers in the UK. Simon, you also mentioned, I think, in your opening remarks, talking about how with the decarbonisation of the grid, actually, we're all getting to a zero carbon operational perspective by doing very little. Actually, we think that's something we've really got to look at and understand and interrogate. We always use timber. We think that's really important. I think making the correct material choices is really important. We've also developed our own innovative materials like our 3D printed brick. That takes a lot of courage. So using new materials or using materials that insurers might be nervous about is something that we all have to think about, and how we can challenge and educate people. And actually, I do think the supply chain is being driven in this direction, and we're passionate about it. There's 2 key pieces of EU legislation that are actually impacting us, and our customers are now asking for. First is the EU taxonomy regulations. We're starting to look at how sustainable and how ESG-driven investments are, and companies and organisations are. And then there's the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the want by investors to be categorised as Article 8 or Article 9, which is essentially the most sustainable, the most ESG-focused investments. If you can demonstrate and deliver against that, you are putting yourself into some very rarefied air, and that attracts a lot of excitement and actually compels investors to work with you. So there's a very good economic reason to look in this direction too. There's my answer.
Thank you, Andrew. And finally, and properly this time, Priya Gupta, who's a building physics engineer at the Active Building Centre, who were a critical part of the construction sector deal. So some great insights in terms of how you can make carbon positive buildings. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon. I'll just give a quick feedback on what Active Building Center is. It was founded in 2018 as part of the Transforming Construction Challenge, and it's a center of excellence where our roots in Swansea, but we have our research facility in Berkeley, Gloucestershire. And at Active Building Center, we believe in decarbonizing at the building level, where we are not just following the energy hierarchy of like fabric first approach, but also we support the grid by decarbonizing and reducing the demand at the building level, but also intelligently integrating all the technologies. And it could be in respect of heat, power, and transport, and enabling grid to vehicle charging and vehicle to building charging, and integrating the whole system as a one, which makes active buildings separate from and different from other sort of energy efficient buildings. But however, as we know, the grid is decarbonizing at a very rapid speed, and the concern that we see here is usually that the operational and embodied carbon balance. I think that is very critical for the industry to pick up and address moving forward. And another point that I would like to raise, with our experience with working in the industry, which I've seen like Simon and uh, Alex just mentioned about, was the supply chain issues and how we need to have a coherent and a cohesive approach towards net zero carbon, because that's one of the things that we've noticed, that even though there are consultants out there who can provide you with the whole life carbon approach, but the definition and the scope is so varied that you might not have the similar results if a report is done by two different organizations. So I think it's important to upskill our existing task force, but also prepare the future task force in taking up these sort of assessments at an early design stage from the perspective of a designer, because I think that's the right stage where you have to take up all these assessments, not only to meet compliance and reduce the operation targets, but to deliver reality and reduce the performance gap in the buildings. Thank you.
And that last point was a really good one, actually, which I think we'll come back to. So a really interesting range of speakers. And what I'd say is I think we've got Andrew and Priya, who are right on the cutting edge of delivering very high performing buildings. And I get the impression that Alex and Simon, to some extent, are having to think more about how you bring the the whole industry along. And perhaps we can start with that kind of dimension. And Alex, you mentioned very briefly your involvement via Riva with Leti. And Leti has actually set some fairly challenging targets for the industry, which you yourself almost like recognise that it's got a long way to get to meet those targets. So perhaps could you just maybe with Simon Sturgis as well, articulate how those Leti standards are helping draw the industry to a position where it can get to where Andrew and Priya pretty want to be at now?
It's a good question, Simon. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we definitely see them as a driver to help bring with the full industry upwards, whilst not getting in the way of those that are at the top. Yeah, the targets themselves at the moment, they've been derived from bottom-up modelling. So a stretch on what is currently deliverable, and then setting a framework around that with a rating scheme that we've adopted in the RBA's version of their challenge, and setting a 2030 target specifically. 2030 target it's nominal in that really we need people to attempt to be doing it immediately rather than waiting till 2030. So we're going to have to get better at it. And the buildings we're going to be building in 2030 are going to have to be designed, at least 5 years before that. So we've not got long to get our act together. So the targets themselves, though, because they're bottom-up model, they're not necessarily the targets that we need to meet to meet the Paris Accord. So there's another piece of work that's being undertaken this year based on the UK GBC's roadmap, which has a trajectory to take the construction industry, the whole construction industry, down to what you could call net zero. So it's very, very low carbon. And to achieve that, we're going to have to do some quite serious maths and politics to identify the amount of carbon we can have per year, per sector, to get a good asset level targets per square meter. So it's a big job, but that's what we need to get to. So it's the way we've seen it is our version of it in the RBA was an educational tool. So it's to try and make people aware of the problem in a serious way and identify a route to get there. So alongside kind of detailed technical guidance on the approaches you can take that Letty have established, we want to make sure that we bring our industry with us. So Simon, do you concur?
Well, perhaps I can. I'm going to take the question on a little bit further, and Simon, I mean, you in your sort of summary at the start, you talk quite a bit about sort of the stuff that people could do today at no cost relative to this of 1990 baseline, which is obviously a long way away, and you also mentioned the mythical part Z. Which I think the industry would really like as almost being the sort of thing that makes them have to do this stuff around embodied carbon rather than sort of do it optionally with the support of their client. And the question I think is how quickly do you think we can accelerate beyond that sort of 15 to 20% that you've described if we start to introduce regulation to make this a non-optional activity and therefore create lots of incentives for the manufacturing sector and what have you? Oh,
Yeah, sorry. I think that is the key question. I think that direction from the government in the sense it doesn't need to be anything special in the way of expending money or anything, but it to be thing that's tangible in the way of if you like, political support, and indeed if government their own projects. Doing whole life carbon assessments on all government projects, that would be a big. I find that the supply chain would start very quickly because at the moment it's really driven by the private sector, and so it becomes a commercial incentive to sell low carbon products, if I can put it like that, products. But if you got the support of the kind of the government support, I think you would find that this would speed up really quickly, and we needed to. I mean, every 6 months that goes by is 6 months lost and wasted to achieving a net zero. I think what's also interesting is the types of construction and also the reuse of buildings. Look at the sort of downward trajectory to net zero by 2050. The target is changing it gets more year for what you have to achieve. But I think that again is to do with incentivization and enthusiasm. And I think you don't have to look at a session like this to see that people are really enthusiastic about this, but they just need some proper central guidance.
okay, thank you on that. I'm really interested, Andrew. I mean, you describe. I mean, your business. You've clearly innovated and you've created your own products. You are sort of stretching it quite a long way. Two aspects I'm interested in. I think one is from a customer perspective, whether you're actually finding that that's a really high AAA plus rating, whether that actually is a differentiator in the mass market rather than what you might describe as sort of like the niche market. And secondly, I think, and probably more importantly for this audience, is whether you can bring your supply chain with you. So, can you access the products that you're looking for readily? Are people innovating fast enough to meet your needs? So perhaps if we do the are you meeting your customers' needs question first, and then we can do that one about whether your supply chain are supporting you.
So as an organisation, we are primarily a B2B type organisation. So we typically sell to other businesses rather than customers directly. Our customers are sometimes developers. Our biggest customer is the IKEA group, Bukluk, their development business. And we also work with a number of institutional investors that are focused on the build-to-rent, affordable housing type sectors. So they are large customers. They are focused on delivering a high-quality asset. They're quite often long-term holders of the asset. So they are really looking for a sustainable product. And there's a real correlation for them between customers being able to afford their rent and pay their rent every month, so i.e. very low bad debt, and particularly high performance from an environmental perspective, because the customer can afford the bills, they can also afford the rent every month. When we talk to housing associations, the worst performing assets from a voids and bad debts perspective are quite often those with the lowest environmental EPC standard. So there is a correlation between sustainability and income. We're starting to see now also a creep towards customers paying more for a house that is more sustainable. I don't think this is universal, and I think it's a slow movement, but in certain areas, and I think we would pinpoint maybe the Cambridge, Oxford Arc, Brighton, Bristol, actually those areas, we're starting to see that customers will pay a premium for a higher EPC score on a property. They do value that sustainability. That's certainly not universal, but that is starting to happen. So yes, we see customers demanding that. And in that sort of very low embodied carbon space, we're not seeing a lot of competition there at the moment. We see lots of competition around net zero carbon, so that's the operational carbon. But the use of an air source heat pump in a new house tied with a few PVs will deliver you net zero carbon fairly easily on primary energy consumption. I've been careful to sort of classify what I mean by it, because there's lots of different definitions of net zero carbon. When it comes to bringing the suppliers with us, there are lots of people out there with exciting technologies, great ideas, not all of which are appropriate, not all of them which work for us. So what we do is we spend a lot of money on research and development. We work with our R&D team to identify new ideas. We test those, we use them in our product. We build lots of prototypes. So we will actually build prototype houses where we will test new ideas, new concepts. If we cannot find something in the market that meets our requirements, we'll go and develop something ourselves. And our 3D printed brick is an example. If you look at the embodied carbon of bricks, we make bricks in an oven for up to 5 days at up to 1,000 degrees C. That's not a particularly sustainable way of doing things. Actually, what we've done is we've created a product that's much lower embodied carbon, so about 5 to 10% of the embodied carbon, and actually probably lower cost as well, and gives us much more flexibility. So there are better solutions out there. It just takes the time to go through, test and research them.
Okay, and Priya, I think this is a great opportunity to turn to you actually, because you are clearly on the edge from a point of view of active product development. So can you sort of perhaps give us an insight into kind of what you're seeing for the kind of systems that have been developed by the Active Building Centre, and where you think the opportunities are most likely to be seen? Are they going to be in housing? Is it going to be schools? Where's it going to appear?
I think with our background and the experience so far, we have worked very closely with housing associations. And as Andrew mentioned, like there's a link between sustainability and cost and the EPC rating and the comforts. And that's what we've witnessed, that most of the housing associations and the councils are struggling with the lowest EPC rated housings and their sustainability, because that's the challenge. And I think that's what we have been sort of developing here at Active Building Center, that if you are able to make an energy efficient home, there might not be a need for an air source heat pump, because if the fabric is so good that you could just do with, like an infrared heating system. So that's something that here at Active Building Center we are developing into a infrared heating testing facility at our Berkeley site, where we would be able to test different solutions and technologies. And the other thing that we are aiming to do at active site over here is, because we have 3 demonstrator homes depicting various building standards. So one from 2000 and the other from 2007, and one for future home standards as well. So we aim to see what sort of technologies can be combined together to reduce the demand and make it more efficient on the building in the terms of operational demand.
Yeah. Okay. Now we've got our first question come in, and I'll just say to the audience that there's plenty of time for extra Q&A. So in this instance, I would encourage people that if you're inspired by our excellent panel, to get your questions in. This is from Sam Cannon, and he's asking the question, which is, how far away do we think are from seeing whole life carbon assessments actually implemented into UK building regulations? And in particular, and this probably picks up a point that Simon, you were making actually, which he also asked, is do we need those kind of assessments to standardize some of the definitions of buzz phrases and such like that the industry uses? So I don't know if there's, Simon, this is probably a good one for you to kick off on generally, actually. So you have a start.
Well, I hope it's sooner rather than later. I mean, I think what we've done as a group led by Will Arnold at iStructD is to draft out a kind of proof of concept, if you like. And we've got about 160 supporters from across industry. We've had a launch at the House of Lords, I think it was. But what we're hoping for is that this gets picked up and ideally comes into sort of force, you know, in a perfect world, it to come in, let's say, next year at the earliest. Reality is probably it'll take a bit longer, but I think also what we want to try and do is ensure that planning is parallel to this. So, for example, in London, you've got the GLA New London Plan, which includes a whole life carbon piece to that policy SI2, and places like Manchester and one or two others, Dundee, I think, also have their own whole life carbon policies. But to get it spread nationally, of course, you need central government to bring it into the national policy framework. So I don't know. Let's hope it happens sooner rather than later, because I think people are desperate for guidance. And certainly the message I think that many of the people who spoke at the inquiry gave to the committee of MPs was that, you know, the industry is keen for this to happen. They know it's coming. Let's just get on with it, and let's make it easy to happen.
Okay, Alex, you're in your initial introduction, you talked about competence and the mission the RIBA and other institutes have in terms of raising a competence. If whole life carbon assessments were brought in, as Simon says there, you know, within the next year or so, is the capability in the industry to respond to that need?
I think there's a definitely emerging capability. You know, we've got a good collection. Simon, in fact, has set up his own whole life carbon network, which is growing and growing. So we know that there are a great deal of individual professionals who can carry this out. But on a whole scale, no, I don't think we have enough people yet. So we do need people to do more of attempting. So, you know, part of our work is not just about forcing people to prove competence in a certain area, but also to give them the confidence to have a go. And that if we don't start having a go at whole life carbon assessments, we're never going to get it right. We've been trying to do getting energy modeling sorted for 30 years plus, you know, in a really detailed way, and we still haven't got that nailed. So, you know, we've got a long way to go, and the complexity of language that Simon picked up is improving on a weekly almost basis. You know, so it's really fast paced. And what's really exciting about whole life carbon assessments is that they're not for any one discipline; they're for everybody. In fact, on a project, you really need all key professionals taking part in that process, and that's what we'd like to see. But without attempting and without recording and providing some form of data collection, then it's going to be really difficult to persuade government that we need to have regulation. So part of the project, the Built Environment Carbon Database project that I mentioned earlier, is about that purpose. If we can get a really solid database together, we can prove where we are right now to try and get government to help us get to the next level, the next step.
Okay. And we've had another question come in from Neil Wallace, and this is quite an interesting one, going off on a, well, broadening the perspective, because Neil's interested in the extent to which this kind of standards that we're talking about here around sort of operational and embodied carbon and operational impact, they will deal with judgmental issues such as service life, which of course deals with sort of whole life carbon and such like. So any views on the panel at all on that one?
Well, I'll add that it's part of that language problem again, as a starting point, in that we all call things different things, but also a detailed understanding of the modules for whole life carbon assessment would be my starting point.
Yeah,
and I think sorry, Simon. I was just going to follow Alex to say that I think also I completely support what he said about understanding the modules, but understanding the effect and the linkages between all these things. So, for example, Pragya mentioned earlier about the relationship between operational and embodied. And I think that's really important, that these, you take an action to reduce operational energy use, and that has an embodied carbon consequence. So what we want to know is what the relationship between those two things are. It's a carbon cost benefit equation that we need to be aware of. And consequently, one of the things in the definitions will be that net zero covers both operational and embodied. You can't separate them out. You've got to be net zero for the whole lot.
And I guess one of the underlying themes from Neil's question is that some of those service life standards that have been set by industry for years, are they too short? And actually, can you keep things going for longer and therefore get more life out of them? Now, we have about 4 minutes left for the session, and I thought it's worthwhile just wrapping up with perhaps giving everybody on the panel a chance to sort of have their sort of desert island moment where they could say, if there was one thing that could be changed to the existing approach to regulating carbon emissions or dealing with other aspects of net zero, what would it be? And Pragya, I'll ask you to go first, and we'll go reverse order this time.
Thank you, Simon. I think it has been a very interesting discussion, and I think what I feel as being a part of the industry and the research organization as well is like the need for a coherent and cohesive approach to whole life carbon, where there's like one document which states the whole definition and the meaning, and instead of the client specifying the scope, it's written in the scope what the definitions are and what the service lives are, and it is a standard approach which can be adopted throughout the industry rather than just having your own methodologies and standards. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, so actually what we've got to do is got to think about the end user and what carbon and what how they want to use those buildings, and not necessarily drive what we might think as people that work in the built environment, but actually think about how that person who's going to use that building for the longer term is going to interplay and interact with the technology we put in it.
Okay, thank you. Simon.
Well, I'd like to say that I think we're actually at the beginning of a very exciting time for architecture, engineering, and construction, because I think if you look at a lot of the buildings that are still being built in the city, for example, today, they basically go back 100 years in terms of their, so we haven't changed much in 100 years or so. And I think we're at the cusp of some really major changes, and I think that's very exciting.
Okay. And finally, Alex.
Well, my main request would be for industry to have a go at whole life carbon assessments, just to have a go, even unprompted by government, but really for government to require them, even without targets at first, just so that we collect the data.
Yeah. Right. Well, thank you all really much. My takeaway from this, I think, is that whilst these carbon assessments are very much optional at the moment, we're approaching a tipping point. And I think Andrew's point, his observation that sort of investors really value these, and actually that low buildings with a low cost of operation actually have an investment value behind them, I think gives us a sense that there will be a stronger pull for this kind of ability to demonstrate that buildings are performing in the way that they should. And if we link that to the previous session where we were discussing the way that KPIs gave clients the power to make the decisions that they need to, I think you can start to see there's a real context for this kind of measurement and assessment to make a difference. So I think we're about 20 seconds to the end of the session. So at that point, I'm going to say we're going to close for a short networking break. We're going to be back at 14:55. So all it requires me to say is to say, Alex, Simon, Andrew, Priya, thank you ever so much for your insight, input, and for a really good discussion. And I look forward to the next session. So see you shortly. Goodbye.